Late one winter evening, when the wind rolled across the plains like a restless spirit, a quiet rancher rode back toward his land with a burden he never expected to carry. Folks in town knew him as the kind of man who spoke little and worked hard, someone who kept to his cattle, his fences, and his own thoughts. He rarely visited the saloon, never joined town meetings, and spent most nights alone beneath the dim glow of a lantern. No one knew much about his past, and he preferred it that way. But that night, as his tired horse trudged through the frozen dirt, he wasn't alone. Behind him walked 10 weary Apache travelers, injured, hungry, and carrying the weight of days on the run. He found them near the dry creek bed while checking a broken fence line. They weren't armed for battle or painted for war like the stories told in town. They were exhausted, almost too weak to stand. 2 elders leaned against one another. A young boy carried an even younger child on his back, and a tall woman with stern eyes kept them together with calm instructions spoken in a low voice. Their condition didn't speak of danger, only desperation. Snow-covered tracks behind them hinted at long travel and longer suffering. The rancher hesitated, knowing well what the town would say if he returned home with Apache people under his roof. To most folks, anything different stirred trouble, but his conscience didn't bend to public judgment. With slow breath and quiet resolve, he motioned for them to follow. He didn't ask where they came from, nor what drove them away from their own land. They didn't explain. They only moved silently, as though the cold itself might swallow them if they stopped too long. When he reached the ranch, he guided them into his barn first, where the air was warmer and hay could offer some comfort. He brought water from the well, blankets from his cabin, and a kettle of broth he'd planned to save for himself. The tall woman whispered a soft word of thanks in her tongue. The rancher nodded, not expecting more. All night he worked by lamplight, tending to them like fragile livestock pulled from a storm. He wrapped wounds, washed dirt from tired faces, and checked fevers without question. The barn filled with quiet breathing instead of horses and cattle. Outside, the plains remained silent, unaware of the strange alliance forming under worn wooden beams. A stray mustang, one he never managed to tame, stood watch by the fence as if sensing something unusual. The rancher didn't sleep. He sat near the door with his rifle across his lap, not from distrust of them, but because he knew the kind of people who would come if word spread. By dawn, whispers began drifting across town. Someone riding early to water their mules saw tracks leading to the ranch. Someone else swore they spotted dark silhouettes in the barn. By the time the sun climbed over the hills, men at the saloon were already telling stories. Some claimed the rancher was hiding a band of raiders preparing for attack. Others said he'd gone mad, ready to betray the town that barely acknowledged him. A few shrugged, saying it was no one's business. But curiosity has a cruel way of stirring fear, especially when mixed with old grudges and half-learned tales. The rancher saddled up and rode into town later that morning to buy more food, blankets, and medicine. He didn't plan to explain himself, yet folks demanded answers the moment he tied his horse outside the trading post. They crowded him with questions, warnings, and sharp accusations. Faces turned red with anger, not because they knew anything, but because imagination often paints trouble faster than truth. He kept calm, saying only that help was help, and no man should turn away the hungry. His words didn't settle them. If anything, they stirred deeper tension. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, the Apache group slowly recovered. The young boy carried water from the trough with surprising discipline. The tall woman helped repair torn leather straps and organize food carefully, making sure nothing was wasted. The elders rested, warmed by the crackling fire in the cabin fireplace he finally opened for them. The youngest child, barely able to speak, watched the rancher's horse with wide eyes, tracing its mane with small fingers. They weren't guests expecting comfort, nor captives seeking safety. They acted like people who had lost nearly everything and were trying to stand again with dignity, but peace never holds long when outsiders look on. On the second evening, hoofbeats thundered near the gate. A group of armed townsmen arrived, demanding to search the property. Their voices carried both anger and fear. They argued that Apache people meant trouble, that danger always followed them, and that the rancher had no right to decide for everyone. The rancher stood firm on his porch, hands steady, refusing to move aside. He wasn't a man who started fights, but he was a man who finished what he stood for. Behind him, the Apache group remained silent, watching through cracks in the walls, unsure whether to trust a stranger or prepare to flee once again. The tension thickened like storm, clouds gathering without thunder. The tall woman clenched her jaw, ready to protect her people if things turned poorly. The young boy eyed the door, ready to pull the elders to safety. The rancher didn't reach for his rifle, though it leaned just inside, close enough to remind everyone he wasn't helpless. The men outside argued louder, voices rising with fire and fear. They claimed they were defending their families. They insisted the rancher was blinded by sympathy. They believed danger was only one heartbeat away. The rancher knew words might not be enough. He spoke calmly about honor, about helping the helpless, about how the world was big enough for them all. But some men only listened to their own echo. One of the younger townsmen stepped forward, hand on his revolver, ready to force his way into the cabin. The rancher stepped off the porch, boots sinking into cold dirt, eyes locked on the man's hand. The wind fell silent. The sky dimmed with evening light. The entire ranch held its breath, balanced on a thin edge between violence and mercy. Then, before a single weapon was drawn, the elders inside began to chant softly, a low rhythmic hum that rolled like ancient wind. The sound froze everyone where they stood, not because it threatened, but because it carried a sorrow deeper than words. The rancher glanced back, unsure what it meant. The townsmen shifted uneasily, unsure whether it was prayer, warning, or farewell. What followed in the next moments would change the town forever. Everyone felt it building, like something unseen moving across the land, something stronger than fear itself. The rancher could sense that whatever drove those 10 souls to his gate was far bigger than a simple rescue. And before the truth revealed itself, before the town understood the cost of turning its back, the night fell still. Waiting for what came next, the rancher drew a slow breath, preparing to speak again, to hold the line not just for them, but for himself. But just as he parted his lips, a distant horn echoed from beyond the hills, carried by the wind in a way that made even the bravest men tighten their grip. All eyes turned toward the dark horizon, wondering who or what approached the ranch now, and why its arrival would shake everything already hanging by a thread. The horn echoed again, longer this time, as if calling across the vast land to someone who had drifted too far. The men on horseback stiffened, eyes scanning the ridge beyond the ranch. Even the restless wind seemed to settle, as though waiting to see what direction fate would choose. The rancher did not move from the dirt path where he stood. He lifted his chin slightly, listening for anything that might explain why such a sound would come now. On a night already heavy with trouble, inside the cabin, the tall woman placed a steady hand on the young boy's shoulder, guiding him away from the door. The elders paused their chant, not because they felt safe, but because something old and familiar stirred beyond the hills. The rancher didn't understand their customs, but he recognized when people heard something that meant more to them than he could grasp. The youngest child hugged a folded blanket, eyes wide as though sensing something that carried both fear and hope. The townsmen exchanged nervous looks. One of them muttered that the sound might mean more riders were coming. Another insisted it could be a hunting call, warning others of danger. A third said it was nothing but cattle horns echoing off stone. But none of their voices raised with confidence, because deep inside, each man recognized what pride refused to admit. The plains rarely cried out without reason. The rancher took a few steps back toward the porch, choosing to stand where he could shield the door if things turned bad. He didn't touch his rifle, though his fingers brushed the wood for a moment, almost unconsciously. He wasn't preparing to fight. He was preparing to protect. There was a difference. The horn sounded a third time, now joined by faint drumming in the distance. The rhythm was slow, steady, and carried with purpose. Though far, it rolled across the land like a heartbeat, each beat growing closer. The townsmen began backing toward their horses. They argued in hushed tones, no longer loud enough for pride to carry their voices. One suggested they return to town to gather more men. Another whispered that they should warn their families. The youngest, the one eager to draw his weapon before, tried to hide the tremor in his hands. The rancher spoke low, firm, telling them to leave in peace, reminding them that no good came from acting out of fear. The men mounted up one by one, some leaving without looking back, others staring hard at the cabin as though trying to memorize its walls in case they needed to return with force. They rode out in a cloud of dust, not quite retreating, not quite advancing, leaving uncertainty behind like a cold draft. Beneath a cracked door, only when their hoofbeats faded did the rancher slip back inside the cabin. The warmth greeted him like a sigh of relief, though nothing felt settled. The tall woman watched him from beside the fire, eyes unreadable. She didn't seem frightened of the approaching sound, only thoughtful, as though she knew what it meant long before anyone else did. The young boy sat near the elders again, tending to a pot of herbs warming over the fire. The child slept peacefully now, small chest rising and falling without strain. The rancher finally spoke, asking if they recognized the sound. The tall woman hesitated, then nodded once. Her tone remained soft and guarded as she said the horn belonged to people who were searching for them, though she didn't say whether those people came with kindness or harm. The rancher didn't push for more. He sensed she wasn't holding back out of secrecy, but out of caution. Trust takes time, especially when the world had taken so much from them already. He stepped back outside for air. The night sky stretched wide, dotted with cold stars that cared nothing for trouble below. The drums had grown faint again, hiding themselves in the wind. He leaned on the railing of his porch, wondering how a man who never asked for attention ended up in the center of a storm that stretched across cultures, histories, and land older than his ranch. Maybe this was what happened when someone chose to do what others feared to do. Maybe kindness had a price, and the bill always came due. He gazed across the open fields where the prairie grass swayed like distant ocean waves. His ranch had always been quiet, a place where cattle moved slow and simple days passed without noise. Now the land felt charged, like something weighted beneath the soil, eager to rise. He remembered traveling through those plains years ago, before he owned a single fence post. He recalled lonely nights around campfires where he first learned to respect silence, not as emptiness but as a place where truths lingered before speaking. He never expected that silence would one day carry the weight of people depending on him. Inside, the group settled into a fragile routine. The tall woman organized supplies, careful not to waste anything. The boy helped repair broken saddle straps belonging to the rancher, proving he learned quickly. The elders whispered to each other in a tone filled with remembrance, like they carried stories they hoped someone might one day understand. The rancher gave them space. He didn't see them as a burden, only as travelers caught in something larger than any single life. By the next morning, the rising sun painted the land in warm gold, giving a false sense of peace. Birds returned to the fence posts. The Mustang grazed calmly near the barn, but the rancher felt tension beneath the quiet. He saddled his horse early, planning to ride out toward the ridge to understand who might be approaching. Before he mounted, the tall woman walked up to him. She placed a hand on the saddle horn, not to stop him, but to steady her thoughts before speaking. She finally explained they had left their homeland not because of battle, but because they had been forced from it by a group that cared nothing for their ways. They had been traveling for days, trying to find a safe path toward a relative settlement in the southern mountains. The horn, she said, belonged to those who once led them, but she didn't know whether they came to help or demand something else. She spoke with pride, not weakness, letting the rancher hear truth without apology. He listened with patience, then nodded, saying he would scout ahead, not to interfere but to know what direction danger or safety approached from. She didn't try to stop him. She only warned that not all who carried their traditions carried peace. The rancher mounted up and rode out at a slow pace, scanning the horizon. Tracks appeared faintly along the dry stream bed, too many for a simple hunting party. He followed them until the canyon walls rose like ancient guardians. The drums echoed faintly, clearer now, layered with voices he couldn't understand. He turned back before getting close enough to be spotted. Whatever group was coming would reach his land soon, and the town might return sooner than that. The ranch was becoming the crossroads of two worlds, with him standing alone between them. When he returned, the air had shifted again. Smoke rose from town, not from fire, but from heated gathering. Someone had spread the news faster than he could ride. People gathered in front of the saloon, their faces lit with argument and anger. Some wanted to send the sheriff to the ranch. Others believed the rancher should be left alone, saying he'd never brought harm to anyone. But loud voices drown quiet ones easily, especially when fear stirs their hearts. Back at the ranch, the tall woman stood outside, watching the horizon with steady eyes. The boy stood beside her, arrowhead necklace tapping gently against his chest. The elders sat near the fire, whispering again as though blessing the earth beneath them. The rancher dismounted slowly, looking from them to the distant dust rising from town. Trouble was closing in from both directions like a tightening noose. The land felt smaller by the minute, though nothing around them had moved. He knew the moment to stay quiet had passed. Soon he would have to choose whether he stood alone or demanded others listen, and just as he opened his mouth to speak, the horn sounded a fourth time, closer, this time not distant and wandering, but direct. Coming straight for the ranch. The ground trembled lightly beneath their boots. As if riders approached in numbers large enough to make the earth remember them, the ground vibrated like distant thunder rolling beneath the soil. Steady and deliberate, the rancher and the tall woman stood side by side, neither stepping back, though both knew what was coming would change everything. The boy moved closer to the elders, keeping himself ready without fear. They had endured too much to run again, yet the weight of uncertainty pressed on every breath. The rancher tightened the reins on his horse, even though he hadn't mounted. He wanted to be prepared in case the situation demanded movement faster than words. Dust lifted along the far ridge. Sunlight caught flashes of metal, maybe spearheads, maybe tools, maybe weapons. The tall woman's expression shifted ever so slightly, a mixture of recognition and caution. She told the rancher in a low voice that the group had ties to her people, but not necessarily to the 10 who stood under his roof now. Their history stretched beyond simple alliances. Some among them believed survival meant bending to outside demands, while others believed holding on to their ways meant never bowing again. The ones who approached might be seeking those who left, hoping to bring them back. But returning didn't always mean safety. Before the newcomers reached shouting distance, the rancher signaled the group inside to stay calm. He stepped forward, planting himself between the barn and the house, where he could see both directions. The wind carried dust toward him, along with the rhythmic thump of hooves. As the riders drew near, he saw that they moved with purpose, not charging, not sneaking, but advancing in a solemn line. Their horses were lean, built for endurance. Their clothing carried patterns stitched by hand, symbols that told stories he couldn't read. Their leader rode at the front, tall and strong. With a bearing that carried authority without raising a voice, the riders stopped a short distance from the gate. The leader dismounted slowly, leaving his hands open and visible. He studied the rancher with steady eyes, then shifted his gaze toward the tall woman standing near the porch. He spoke to her in their tongue, his words firm yet heavy, as though delivering a message he wished he didn't have to give. The rancher watched the exchange without interrupting, not understanding the words but feeling the tension beneath them. The woman listened with silent strength, her posture straight, but her fingers curled slightly against her side, revealing what her face did not. When she finally responded, her voice carried emotion, though quiet and controlled. The leader nodded once, not satisfied, not angry, simply acknowledging truth. He then turned to the rancher and spoke in broken English. He explained that these 10 were once part of their community, but had left under difficult circumstances. He didn't call them traitors or refugees. He didn't accuse the rancher of meddling, but he made it clear that leaving had consequences and returning would not erase those scars. He asked why the rancher chose to shelter them. Knowing it drew danger to his own land, the rancher answered simply, saying he helped them because they needed it, and because no person should freeze in the cold when shelter stands nearby. He didn't speak about loyalty or alliances. He didn't offer apologies. The leader listened, neither approving nor condemning. He said he would not take the group by force, but he could not promise that everyone who came after him would hold the same restraint. There were others, he said, who saw division as weakness, who believed control must be maintained or all would be lost. Those people had already heard whispers of this ranch stop before leaving. The leader placed a stone at the gate, carved with a mark shaped like a rising arrow. The tall woman stared at it, understanding more than the rancher could. The riders mounted up and left the same way they came, their departure as disciplined as their arrival. The rancher watched them vanish into the horizon. When he turned to the tall woman for answers, she shook her head softly, saying only that the stone meant warning and debt together, and that one day someone would return to collect on it. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted again. The elders looked at the stone from afar, whispering among themselves. The young boy sat sharpening a tool, his movements tight with frustration. The child played quietly, unaware of how much weight hung in the air around them. The rancher finally asked the tall woman what drove them from their home. She hesitated, torn between speaking and protecting her people's history. In time, she shared fragments. Their village had been pressured to move closer to a settlement controlled by outside traders. Some leaders agreed, believing cooperation would keep them safe. Others resisted, fearing their identity would be lost if they abandoned sacred land. The 10 who now lived under the rancher's roof had been caught in the middle. They refused to choose sides, believing that forcing unity by threat was no unity at all. When tensions rose, fires spread, not from enemies outside but from hands within. They fled to avoid becoming weapons in someone else's vision of what their people should be. Their past was not simply sorrow. It was tangled with pride, conflict, and choices without perfect answers. The rancher listened without judgment. He knew what it felt like to leave a life behind, carrying silent wounds no one else understood. He didn't speak of his own past, though memories tugged at the edges of his thoughts. The tall woman noticed his silence, but didn't pry. Meanwhile, back in town, rumors grew louder. The sheriff tried to stay neutral, saying the rancher hadn't broken any laws, but his voice carried little influence when fear guided decisions. The saloon owner stirred talk by claiming the riders he saw near the ridge worked with raiders known for ambush. The blacksmith argued that the rancher should be thanked for preventing desperate travelers from taking what they needed by force. The baker claimed none of it concerned everyday folks, but fear needed no facts, only fuel. Quiet families began storing supplies. Some packed essentials in case they needed to flee. A few young men spoke about riding out to confront the rancher, not to attack him, but to make him choose between town and strangers. They claimed loyalty meant protecting their own. But no one agreed on who counted as their own anymore. The rancher felt the town drifting away from him, though he hadn't sought a place among them to begin with. Still, he understood that once suspicion takes root, it spreads where trust used to grow. He spent evenings reinforcing the barn door, not to lock anyone in, but to keep both fear and violence from reaching those who sought rest. The tall woman helped, fastening wooden beams with practiced hands. The boys stood on lookout, scanning both the plains and the town road. One night, when the wind carried a faint echo of distant drumming again, the rancher sat alone by the corral. The mustang grazed close, as if sensing his unease. He felt pulled between worlds, not because he belonged to either, but because both pressed their weight onto his land. He wondered how long he could stand in the middle before someone demanded a choice. He wondered if protecting them meant losing his own safety. And he wondered if doing nothing would be worse. From the cabin doorway, the tall woman watched him, her expression softened by the flickering firelight behind her. She seemed to recognize in him the same burden she carried, though for different reasons. After a moment, she stepped outside and joined him by the fence. They didn't speak at first. The silence between them felt like shared understanding rather than distance. After a long pause, she told him there were more people coming. Not warriors, not hunters, but families searching for scattered kin. She didn't know if they were being followed or if they traveled freely, but she knew they were coming because the land called those who had been displaced to seek one another again. The rancher looked toward the horizon, where stars blinked faintly like distant campfires. His land, once quiet and solitary, had become crossroads for lives shaped by conflict. Older than the town itself, he asked if they would leave once they found those kin. The tall woman's answer carried both hope and sorrow. She said they could not stay forever, but they needed a place to stand long enough to breathe, to gather strength before choosing a direction. She didn't ask him to become their ally. She didn't ask for protection. She only asked for time. Before dawn, hoofbeats sounded again, softer than before. Not riders of war, but travelers arriving under tired skies. The rancher saw silhouettes approaching, moving slowly, limping, carrying bundles. Not 10 this time, more dot, and in town, men gathered at the edge of the main road. Gripping rifles, watching that same horizon, ready to demand answers from the rancher they barely understood. Night settled slowly over the plains. But the sky didn't offer the same calm it once had. Instead of quiet stars and soft wind, every sound felt sharper. The riders approaching were close enough now that their footsteps stirred dust along the pasture fence. They weren't moving fast, just steady, carrying the tired weight of people who had traveled too far without rest. The rancher counted at least 6 adults and several children, their silhouettes uneven, as though one wrong move might send them collapsing. The tall woman stood beside him, her posture tight. Knowing these travelers were likely fleeing the same conflict that chased the first group, he motioned for the barn door to be opened. The young boy hurried forward, adjusting blankets already laid out. The elders rose from their resting place, holding themselves upright despite aching limbs. The woman watched the approaching group carefully, her face shifting with recognition as she spotted a familiar elder among them. The rancher didn't understand their relationships, but he could see reunion in her eyes even before words were spoken. When the travelers reached the gate, they stopped. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man leaning heavily on a carved staff, raised his hand in greeting. His voice cracked from exhaustion as he spoke in their tongue, then repeated a few broken English words to the rancher, thanking him for shelter. The rancher simply nodded and guided them inside, offering water and blankets without hesitation. But helping them meant more eyes, more mouths to feed, and more attention drawn. He felt the weight of each choice tightening around him. Every soul who came through his gate seemed to pull the world closer to a breaking point. As everyone settled, he looked toward the horizon again. The darkness hid the town, but he could almost feel their eyes on him, gathering strength for whatever confrontation they believed necessary. Rumors had already taken root. With more people arriving, panic would only grow. The rancher spent the next hours reinforcing his property line, not to keep anyone prisoner, but to prevent a stampede of fear from crossing the threshold. He set lanterns along the fence posts, giving light to the night so no rider could claim they arrived by mistake. His hands worked with steady resolve, though his thoughts raced faster than his movements. He wondered what lines might need to be drawn when both sides felt justified in their actions. Inside, the cabin hummed with quiet conversation. The tall woman helped the new arrivals settle in, offering broth, herbs, and blankets. The reunited elder touched her forehead to hers, a gesture that held more meaning than any spoken greeting. The young boy watched from the corner, torn between relief and unease. He was old enough to understand that every reunion came with the risk of loss just as strong. When the rancher finally came inside, the tall woman approached him with a look that carried both gratitude and warning. She told him that these people had been chased not by rival tribes or settlers, but by a group from their own former community who believed unity must be forced. Word had spread that those who left had found refuge with a white rancher. That, she said, would anger those who believed cooperation with settlers should follow a strict path or not at all. To them, his sheltering of these families was interference. The rancher listened, jaw set. He didn't see himself as part of anyone's struggle. He had simply offered shelter because it was right. But he understood now that to others, right and wrong were shaped by history, pride, and wounds older than his fences. Sleep didn't come to anyone that night. The rancher sat near the doorway with his rifle within reach, though he prayed he wouldn't need it. Outside, Coyotes howled in distant ravines, mixing with faint echoes of drums that drifted through the cold air. The land felt divided, every sound carrying a question no one wanted to answer. By morning, the tension thickened even more. A rider from town approached, waving a white cloth, not in surrender but as a sign that he came to speak. The rancher recognized him as the schoolteacher, one of the few men in town who preferred words over bullets. The teacher stopped at the gate, hesitant to cross without invitation. The rancher greeted him with respect. Knowing this moment carried weight, the teacher spoke plainly, saying the town was holding a meeting and wanted the rancher to attend. Many believed his actions endangered everyone. Others argued he was protecting innocence and the town owed him patience. The rancher agreed to come, but only if the gathering remained civil. He didn't trust every voice, but he trusted the teacher enough to take the risk. Before leaving, he asked the tall woman to keep the others inside. She nodded, though her eyes carried worry. She told him that even meetings held in daylight could turn dark if pride guided them. He knew she was right. The town meeting was held near the saloon, where men leaned against barrels and women stood in circles whispering among themselves. The rancher rode in quietly, but every pair of eyes locked onto him. Faces showed fear, anger, curiosity, and even admiration. The sheriff called for silence, his voice rough with strain. He didn't want conflict any more than the rancher did, but he knew he was standing between forces that could crush him if he faltered. Arguments erupted quickly. Some shouted that Apaches were a threat and must be removed before trouble fell on the town. Others argued that these people were refugees, not raiders, and forcing them away would stain the town's honor. A handful demanded the rancher turn over the people to the authorities. A few said the town should help supply them. The rancher stood quietly until voices burned themselves out. Then he spoke, his tone calm but firm. He reminded them he hadn't asked anyone to take sides. He said fear shouldn't decide the fate of hungry families. He said helping strangers in need didn't make him a traitor to his own land. He didn't ask the town for approval, only understanding. Before the sheriff could respond, a man from the back stepped forward, face flushed. He accused the rancher of bringing danger to their children. He claimed the arrivals would lead hostile warriors right to their doorsteps. The rancher didn't raise his voice, but he didn't look away either. He simply asked the man whether turning away the suffering had ever kept danger away. The crowd broke into arguments again. But before anything settled, a young boy burst into town breathless from riding. He shouted that more riders had been seen near the old stone pass, moving fast and carrying banners the town didn't recognize. The words hit the crowd like sparks falling into dry grass. Some ran home to secure doors. Others grabbed rifles. The sheriff ordered scouts to ride out and confirm the report. The rancher mounted up immediately, knowing this wasn't a rumor. The winds had been shifting for days. Something was coming, and it wouldn't simply pass by. As he rode back toward his land, dust stirred behind him. The wind carried the faint beat of drums again, no longer distant. The sky above the western ridge darkened, though no storm clouds formed. When he reached the ranch, the tall woman already waited outside, the new arrivals standing behind her. They all watched him with silent expectation. He dismounted and told her the town was preparing to act. She told him the other side was preparing too. The boy looked between them, understanding that the moment they feared had finally arrived. The reins slipped from the rancher's hands as he looked over his land. Once peaceful, now pulled between two forces climbing toward collision. The plain stretched out around them, quiet but heavy, holding its breath. Then the horn sounded again, closer than ever. The ground shook. Figures appeared along the ridge, lined in formation, moving with purpose. The rancher stepped forward, heart steady. The tall woman stepped beside him, shoulders straight. The town was riding toward them from the east. The approaching group marched from the west. Two worlds, closing in on a single patch of land, with only a lone rancher, a scattered people, and a rising wind standing between them. And the moment before impact hung in the air like a drawn breath, refusing to release. The horn call faded into the wind, but the echo lingered as both groups drew closer. The rancher stood with shoulders squared, refusing to be moved by fear or by pressure. The tall woman stood beside him, hands steady, her people gathered behind her in a tight circle. Children clung to elders. The young boy held his ground near the porch, ready to move where needed. The ranch, once a place of quiet labor, now stood like a borderland, between two worlds that both believed they were right. Dust lifted from the eastern road as the townsmen approached. Rifles slung across saddles, not raised but visible. Their faces showed worry more than anger. They weren't here for blood. They were here for answers. On the western ridge, the approaching group slowed, spreading into a wide semicircle. They carried spears and bows, but none pointed. Their leader, the same man who had visited before, rode forward again, posture calm but firm. No one spoke at first. The plains waited. The rancher finally stepped forward, hands open and empty. He didn't stand as a soldier or a mediator. He stood simply as a man who refused to step aside from what he believed was decent. He faced the leader from the west first, saying he had not taken anyone's people, only sheltered travelers worn down by cold and hunger. He said they had worked alongside him, repaired saddles, tended fires, and caused no harm. The leader listened silently, eyes narrowed not in anger, but in thought. Then the rancher turned to the men from town. He reminded them that fear often twists truth into something unrecognizable. He said helping the helpless didn't put anyone in danger, and if danger ever came, he would stand with the town rather than against it. His voice stayed steady, the kind of steady that couldn't be taught, only lived. A long silence followed, heavy enough to bend the air. Then the tall woman stepped forward. She spoke in her native tongue first to her own people, then turned to the town with calm determination. She explained that her group had never intended to stay forever. They sought peace long enough to heal, regroup, and continue their journey. They weren't fleeing the ranch now, nor returning to the place they left. They were moving toward new land where they could live without choosing sides in old fights. The leader from the west listened as she spoke, and the tension in his shoulders shifted. He didn't argue. Instead, he stepped closer and placed his palm lightly against hers, a gesture that seemed to belong to a tradition older than fences and towns. He told her she could travel without being hunted. He said their bond wasn't broken by leaving, only changed. The townsmen watched, unsure what to do next. The schoolteacher stepped forward, clearing his throat. He suggested that if these families continued their journey peacefully, and the rancher helped them only while they were here, there was no reason for the town to interfere. The sheriff agreed, saying he would not allow anyone in town to act violently without cause. For the first time since this began, the rancher felt the air loosen. The visiting leader turned to the rancher and thanked him. Not with too many words, but with a nod that carried weight. He placed another carved stone at the gate, not a warning this time, but a symbol of passage and respect. The tall woman translated softly, explaining that the mark meant their journey would be remembered and their return would be welcomed, if the land ever called them back, one by one. The travelers gathered their things. Blankets folded, tools bundled, children lifted carefully onto horses. The rancher helped secure saddles. The tall woman watched him for a long moment, then spoke with quiet warmth. She told him he had given more than shelter. He had given them a place where fear didn't decide their future. The young boy stepped forward too, pressing a carved feather into the rancher's hand. A token of thanks carved while the rancher was working fences at dawn. The child waved goodbye with small hands. Clutching the rancher's worn bandana he had given her to stay warm, the rancher watched them ride out across the plains. Not toward the town, not toward the land they left, but toward open country that carried promise. Their silhouettes stretched long under the evening sun, fading into the amber horizon when the last rider disappeared. Only dust and hoofprints remained. The townsmen lingered awkwardly. They realized they had come prepared for conflict that never arrived. The tension drained from their faces, replaced by tired relief. A few approached the rancher to apologize, not with grand speeches, but with small gestures. The schoolteacher shook his hand. The sheriff tipped his hat. Even the loud young man from the saloon mumbled his thanks. Embarrassed that fear had sharpened his judgment, the rancher simply nodded, not holding grudges. He knew people often defended fear more fiercely than truth. By nightfall, the ranch returned to quiet. The lanterns burned low, swaying in the breeze. The Mustang grazed peacefully, no longer pacing the fence line. The rancher stood alone on his porch, staring out over the empty fields where so much had unfolded in so little time. The land felt wide again, open, unburdened. He didn't feel lonely. He felt grounded, as if the world had finally met him halfway. The tall woman's last words lingered with him. She had said that kindness never vanishes, even when the people it touched move on. It takes root in ways unseen, carried in stories, in memory, and sometimes in footsteps that one day returned. As dawn rose again, the rancher saddled his horse and rode along the ridge. The plains were calm. The world felt like it had breathed out. He noticed the carved stones still resting at his gate, one shaped as warning, one as honor. He kept them both. Not to remind himself of conflict, but to remember what it takes to stand firm in who you are. The town slowly returned to routine. Word spread that the rancher had done something rare. Not heroic in a loud way, but decent in a way most folks forgot was possible. The baker greeted him differently the next time they crossed paths. The school teacher visited once to share a meal. Even the saloon crowd spoke of him not as the quiet man on the edge of town, but as someone who held true to his principles when it mattered most. The ranch went back to open skies and quiet labor, but the rancher felt changed. Not in a way that turned him into someone new, but in a way that sharpened who he already was. He looked across his land and knew that sometimes fate chooses the least expecting heart to carry a burden, meant to reshape more than one life. He tended his cattle again. He repaired fences again. He lived simply, but no longer alone in the same way. Somewhere beyond the horizon, families he had sheltered were building new beginnings, carrying pieces of his kindness with them. And if they ever returned, they would find the gate standing open. The plains whispered in the wind, not with tension now, but with quiet gratitude. The rancher let the breeze move past him, settling into the evening light. He didn't need anyone to call him a hero. He just needed the world to stand a little gentler than it had before. And for the first time in a long time, it did.